Good morning, everybody. So thank you to everyone for being online this morning and taking time out of your school. We certainly do appreciate it. My name is Justin Voigt and I'm the Events Manager for Hawker Brownlow Solution Tree Australia. I'd like to just go through some quick housekeeping items firstly. If you find you're having some technical issues, there is a chat dialogue box, and if you choose Solution Tree, that will send me a private message and I'll be able to communicate directly with yourself. There will be also 5 minutes towards the end of this webinar, and that will just go through some questions and answers that John Eller will be more than happy to answer for you. Also, feel free to follow Hawker Brownlow on Twitter as well as Facebook, and then you can just follow that hashtag on Twitter too to start the conversation for this webinar. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome John Eller to the webinar. Unfortunately, just due to work commitments, Sheila Eller is unable to join us today. Just a little bit of a background about John Eller. He has served as a director of a doctoral program at St. Cloud State University. He is a former principal, director of a principal's training centre, and assistant superintendent. Dr. Eller specialises in dealing with difficult people, building professional learning communities, employee evaluations, conferencing skills, coaching skills, strategic planning strategies, school improvement planning and implementation, differentiated instruction, leadership for differentiation, employee recruitment, selection and induction, supervisory skills and effective teaching strategies. So with that, I'm going to hand over the webinar to John Eller now, and I'll be back to you towards the end of the webinar.
Great, thanks Justin. I appreciate your getting us started in the right way. Good morning, everyone. I'm excited to be able to present this webinar today. So the webinar today is based on some of our work with new teachers, and we have a book through Solution Tree called Thriving as a New Teacher. And Sheila and I co-authored this book based on our experiences in leading schools and working with new teachers and helping them be successful. So what we've tried to do is to find those things that either were positive for new teachers or that new teachers needed some assistance with, and we put that together in this resource. The webinar has several outcomes. Let me share them with you. One of the outcomes is I want to make you aware of there are some stages or phases that new teachers go through during their initial year of teaching, and it actually moves beyond the first year into multiple years. We want to talk about that and the importance of, if you're supporting new teachers, recognizing this in helping them. If you're a new teacher, you want to know this so that you can think about what kinds of things are you going to be experiencing emotionally during your initial time. The third outcome of the webinar is we're going to talk about the importance of building relationships. And it's fairly obvious that we focus on building relationships with students, but also we're going to talk a little bit about how do you build relationships with parents and colleagues, and what are some strategies and techniques to help build and strengthen the relationships. And then probably one of the number one issues that new teachers face is related to classroom management. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time focusing on some elements related to classroom management. And then finally, we're going to take a look at other pieces related to managing the curriculum, assessing student progress, and then looking at formative and possibly summative assessments. We have several books that we published through Solution Tree. The one that this webinar is based on is Thriving as a New Teacher, but we have a new book coming out in June called Flip This School, which deals with school turnaround. And then in the past, we had three additional books that we've authored through Solution Tree. One is Working with Difficult and Resistant Staff. That was the basis of the webinar that we did on Tuesday. And then Score to Soar, that's a book written for markets in the United States, which deals with teacher evaluation and moving away from just rating teachers to actually helping teachers grow. And then the book on the right is Achieving Great Impact. And that book was written specifically for Australia and New Zealand and the unique relationship that headmasters and school leaders have in serving as colleagues with their teachers and helping them to grow. One of the points that we want to talk about is just the importance of this whole support of new teachers. And obviously, when we think about a teacher, they can erase a lot of other issues that children bring to the school. So we want to make sure that we can support new teachers because their mark on the future is hard to measure, very, very important. The book is organized around what we called 6 spheres. And as I mentioned, when we developed this book, we wanted to take a look at what were some of the areas that we noticed as we worked with new teachers that were either really helpful for them, or if they didn't get addressed, that could lead to some kind of a detriment for them, or them becoming disenchanted, leaving the profession, those sorts of things. So the 6 spheres are focusing on the self, and we devote quite a bit of time on this topic because a new teacher, they come into the teaching situation being very enthusiastic and maybe thinking that things are going to be really good, but sometimes they get in the midst of it and then they run into trouble. So having a clear awareness of what are your strengths, what are your limitations, what's your preferred teaching style, all of those things are really helpful. So we start off talking about that idea of reflecting on yourself. And then obviously the bulk of the work that new teachers do is really focused on developing relationships with students, helping students grow and learn, understanding the unique elements that students bring, but also getting to know their families and working with the family as collaborators in the success. So we've, again, at the beginning of the book, focused time on this idea of how do we get to know the students, but also how do we begin to develop relationships within the families. And then the third sphere, and I alluded to this in the outcomes of the webinar, is really a clear focus on classroom management. And what's been happening recently related to classroom management is the focus on helping students to learn good habits of learning and behavior. So we tend to focus on how do you teach students the procedures, how do you practice the procedures, how do you help the students to develop really good habits. We know that classroom management's not only about habits, but sometimes you have to work with situations where there might be emotional situations or students can become very frustrated. So we also have a section related to what we call severe disruptions, or in other words, students who may have additional issues that they can become disruptive in the class. Being able to manage people, being able to understand families, being able to manage the classroom, that's a part of what a new teacher does. The fourth sphere deals with how do you manage the curriculum. And curriculum management in today's world really helps teachers to make sure that they're teaching the right kinds of content. They're able to break the content down so that students can learn, because we have a lot of accountability that is coming to us through provincial, governmental mandates. The other piece about the curriculum, which is really important, is it also assists in the management of the class. So sometimes students may have difficulty paying attention or focusing because the curriculum or the particular lesson or outcome of this period is not a match for their skill set. So managing the curriculum also helps with helping students learn and grow and managing the class. The fifth sphere that we focus on is assessment, and moving more toward what is called formative or common assessments. These are periodic types of assessments that teachers can administer that don't take a lot of time, but give them an indication of how are the students doing. And then they use the information from the assessments to make some decisions about what's going to be taught during the next instructional period. What am I going to need to go back and refocus on? A lot of programs that you might be implementing in your school are being based on the idea of having formative or common assessment, such as RTI, that sort of thing. And then finally, the sixth sphere is focused on working with colleagues effectively. So obviously, new teachers can't do it alone. They need to have the support and the connections of their colleagues. Sometimes colleagues can serve as a mentor for a new teacher. Sometimes colleagues can help the new teacher get connected with the school. Sometimes they're working with coaches. Sometimes the leader of the school is serving in a collegial aspect with the teacher. So developing good relationships and knowing how to work with colleagues, that's an important element of success as a new teacher. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar is really designed for several audiences. So if you're in one of these audiences, you'll be able to get some good information out. So the first audience would be people who are tasked with supporting new teachers. So the idea that you might be a mentor, you might be a headmaster, school leader, you might be a coach. You can pick up some strategies to help you as you work with new teachers. And then the second audience, obviously, is new teachers themselves and what they can glean from this particular information. So again, as I mentioned at the beginning, in order to thrive as a new teacher, they need to really have a clear understanding of themselves. They need to look at their strengths. What are their limitations? What are the kinds of experiences that they might encounter as they're teaching? What might be some of the things that work well for them? What might be some of the things that don't work so well? And if you think back to some of your first years of teaching, you know that a lot of times you have to have the mindset to keep moving forward. So we have a section in the book where new teachers actually get an opportunity to think about what are the things that I'm really good at, and what are the things that I might need additional development in. As most of us know, when we interview, we try to make sure that everything sounds good. But when you sit down and think of yourself as a teacher, you have to decide what's your strengths and what are some of your limitations. So having a clear understanding of yourself is really an important element. Now, this figure is actually based on some work done at the New Teacher Center in Santa Cruz, California, but it's applicable to teachers all over the world. And so as you think about when teachers start over on the left-hand side, when they're getting ready to start the school year, you know, maybe in late January or maybe in early January, they're anticipating the start of the school year. They're really thinking about what are they going to do? What kind of an impact are they going to make? How are they going to kind of change the world in a way? So they go through what's called the anticipation phase. The anticipation phase is filled with a lot of optimism, a lot of, they're feeling pretty confident, you know, they're ready to go. What happens within the first couple of months, so probably about the time of the first break in April, they start to get behind, they start to get the realization of, you know, there's a lot of record keeping to do. Sometimes the students aren't always really interested in learning what they're teaching. Maybe they get into the realities. They start to become overwhelmed, and they move into what's called the survival mode. Now, the survival mode is really based on the fact that they feel that they're having difficulty keeping up on a day-to-day basis. What we find is many new teachers are, when school is out, they're spending the evenings working on preparing lessons for the next day, doing the assessment, depending on the level of communication, emailing parents, but there's just never enough time in the day. later in the school year, about midway through, so probably in the maybe mid-May to early June part, they get into a phase called disillusionment. And disillusionment is where they start to begin to second guess themselves. So they think, gee, why did I want to get into teaching? It's not as fun as I thought it was going to be. There's many, they start getting into the realization that things are things are difficult, that there's a lot of things that I can't control, but it's becoming upsetting. This is a really crucial point for new teachers, because this is when they start to make a decision about whether to stay in the profession or leave the profession. So as supporters of new teachers, we want to be watchful of them as they go from survival to disillusionment, because sometimes when we can reach a hand out and help them, or when we can help them reflect through their experience, we can help them get through disillusionment. One of the things I'm going to share with you in a couple of minutes is we have a reflecting template that we use with new teachers. We actually have them think about this at the anticipation phase, letting them know that this is going to happen, disillusionment, and what are some of the skills and capacities that they might have to help get through disillusionment. So again, if they're left alone, sometimes they get through it, but most of the time it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So you have to be really careful and connect with new teachers at this point. Once they get into probably the third period, the third school period or third quarter, probably more into the August to early September, they start to kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel, and they go through a phase called rejuvenation. So in rejuvenation, they start to notice that, hey, some of the techniques I'm using are working with the students. I'm starting to bring around some of the students who are a little bit more reluctant learners, and I'm actually feeling like I can actually do this job. So again, if they can get through the initial stage, now they start to feel more comfortable and confident with themselves. And then toward the end of the school year, October, November-ish, early December, they get into the phase called reflection. This is where they're able to actually look at the year and think about what went well this year, what didn't go so well, and what am I going to do about it. So this is, and again, you might see this in your new teachers where they start to say, next year when I start, I'm going to start differently. Or I'm not going to let these 5 things happen to me next year. I'm going to be more proactive as I move forward. And then finally, about the time of the vacation break, they are going to get into the anticipation phase, which is where they are now they understand and they feel that they can take more control over their environment. So now they start becoming excited again about the teaching year. Now, this work is based on the study of thousands of new teachers. You might see that somebody comes into this and they're natural and they don't go through these phases as much. You might see that maybe the graph, the dip is not quite so deep for some people. But again, this is something that we see over many years of study. This is what I was suggesting to you, and Justin's actually going to send this out to you after the webinar. And one of the nice things about Solution Tree is that all of the resources that are in the book, they put on their website. And so Justin's going to download this. This is a planning sheet, and basically what we recommend is that somebody who's mentoring the new teacher meets with the new teacher, and you have this conversation and you talk through these things. And so, what are some of your feelings that you have? What are some of the strategies? And then what are the results of the strategies? Now, probably at the beginning of the year, you're not going to be able to get into survival and disillusionment, but periodically throughout the school period, as you talk about this, it's really helpful, and it helps build the reflective capacities of the teacher to think about, what am I experiencing? How can I get out of it? And how can I build that capacity? So again, we find this to be really helpful for new teachers. Obviously, we want to develop a mindset, a can-do mindset, but we also want the new teacher to understand that, don't take some things personally, and also don't become overly disillusioned when you find that there's certain things that you cannot necessarily impact. It's kind of that idea of what's our scope of control, and what is it that we think that we can make a difference in. Another mindset that we want to try to develop in the new teacher is the idea that no matter what, keep moving forward, keep trying. If one strategy doesn't work, try another strategy. That idea of what you may have heard of grit, the ability to kind of keep trying and working hard. I mentioned this a few minutes ago, but it's important for new teachers to understand what's the scope of control. So for example, they can't necessarily control the home life of the children. They can't control what happens before the start of the school day. What they can control is how they react to the student, and what's the atmosphere that they consciously set in their classroom. So again, that's an important element to think about, that so there's certain things that I'm not in charge of, but I can make a difference knowing that this is where these students come from. As we work with the new teachers, we try to instill in them a couple of quotes which are really good. And this one kind of sums up this particular section, which is the idea that when you ask kids after they graduate from secondary school, what do you remember about your experience? Many of them remember some of the emotional connections with the teachers. Very few children say, I really liked when we learned how to divide fractions, or I was really excited when I learned about how do you understand the verb and a noun relationship in a sentence. But they talk about the personalities of the teacher. So that's an important element that we need to continually think about. At the beginning of the book, we kind of deal with this idea of the start of the year. The start of the school year is when you actually have the greatest opportunity to build relationships. And again, relationships with students, relationships with parents, relationships with families, colleagues, and then also the school community. Depending on where the school is located, sometimes the actual town or community has much of an interest. And these are the groups that I just talked about. And when we talk about stakeholders, we mean these are people who are connected with the school and they have some interest in the success of the school. So some teachers make relationships with local businesses. Some teachers make relationships with community members, that sort of thing. We try to help new teachers understand that you can build positive relationships pretty simply, and many of them actually are helping the students get to know more about you, that you're a person, that you are interested in their success. So obviously, at the beginning of a period, or at the beginning of the day, the greeting of the students, and actually the sincere greeting, not just smiling when they come in, but talking to them, getting to know them, that sort of thing. The second element deals with the idea of feelings, and the idea that we can actually get to know what are the students feeling and experiencing. That shows them that we're very interested. Classrooms where students have some stake in actually operating the classroom, it tends to build positive relationships. So the idea of having students do some of the jobs is really, really helpful. Bullet point 4, the idea of choices, giving the students an option sometimes to choose between this strategy or this strategy, this activity or that activity is really, really helpful. I talked about the 5th bullet point earlier, which is the idea that, you notice them. And then the sixth bullet point, and this is something that it sounds really common sense, but it's amazing how many teachers forget about this, especially new teachers are nervous. They're trying to get their content in, but listening to the student's story, or listening to the students, what happened to them before school, or the idea that sometimes they have things to tell you that are not even related to what you're teaching, but this idea that I'm going to give the student respect by showing them that I care. And then obviously the idea of interest, and then positive language as you work with students. And that goes back to the mindset that we talked about earlier, that if you develop a positive mindset, I'm happy to be here, then you're going to have a whole different outlook, and your language is going to be much, much better. So again, if you're supporting new teachers, these are some simple activities that you can help them with. Or if you are a new teacher, you can think about using these to build relationships. And then this is just a little bit more of a general kind of a personal relationship element. We've already talked about listening. The second bullet point, some of you may know the skill called paraphrasing, where somebody tells you something and you repeat back kind of the gist of it. That's a skill where we're acknowledging what the person has told us. Reflecting is like paraphrasing, but it's much more direct. Item number 3, again, as an adult, we have to be careful with eye contact. Sometimes we end up with laser beam kind of eye contact where we are staring at the student. So that's why I put appropriate here. Also, students from different backgrounds or cultures might have a different view of eye contact. And what I tell new teachers is take the cue from the student. So if the student feels comfortable looking at you, looking you in the eye, then it's probably appropriate to have that kind of contact. If the student looks for a few seconds and then looks away, then that's a cue for you not to just try to stare at them so that they become nervous. We've already talked about welcoming students. Obviously, keeping up on what's current in their lives. This can be difficult because, as many of us think, oh, I'm never going to lose touch with what's popular. As we grow older and the students gap, the age gap between us and the students gets wider, it's harder for us to really keep up. But, if you can, understanding some of the major things that students of that age group in general like, that's really helpful. And then I on the last bullet point, I wanted to talk a little bit about humor. Sometimes as new teachers, we have gotten into sarcasm. And the problem with sarcasm is it tends to be in the eye of the beholder. So many times, even though students appear to be comfortable with a sarcastic comment, they really are bothered by that. So as we work with new teachers, we try to focus on, don't make the students kind of the focus of the humor. If you're going to say something, maybe use yourself. So say, oh, gee, I forgot about this. I'm getting older, versus, oh, you forgot about it. You must have been too busy. Students don't pick that up because they view you as an adult role model. And again, we're finding in our work with new teachers, sarcasm almost always has a negative impact, even though the student doesn't act like they're being bothered. The second area I want to focus on after relationships is the idea of classroom management. And like I mentioned at the beginning, classroom management now is moving away from more, the teacher's the boss and the students are towing the line, to more of a collaborative kind of focus where the teacher's helping the students develop good learning habits. So that's what we focus on with new teachers. So we talked a little bit about this at the very beginning of the webinar, but classroom management is really kind of focused on 3 different elements, and you can see from the Venn diagram that they all meet in one spot. So obviously, teachers who have good classroom management tend to develop positive, appropriate relationships with students. So they greet them at the door, they show the students that they care, they listen. They focus on how can I develop a very appropriate, positive relationship. Not that they're the friends of the students or that they're going to let the students manipulate them, but it's truly a caring, concerning kind of relationship. The second oval, which is in the lower left-hand corner, deals with the idea of it's the curriculum and the learning and how do we manage that. And so many times if we teach at the proper level of instruction so that the students are successful, we're going to minimize disruption. If we are explaining things not very clearly, or if we are trying to teach something that is way above the student's level, then we're going to get that acting out behavior. And then finally, the third oval deals with this idea of how do we manage all of the different types of behaviors that need to happen in a classroom. And so when we work with classroom management with new teachers, we first of all try to help them to identify what would be their preferred teaching style. Excuse me, would it be lecturing? Would it be having the students work in small groups? Would it be a laboratory setting? If they think about that, then in the process and procedure management, it's helpful for them to think about what are all of the skills that students would need to learn in order to be successful in that style. Now, keep in mind, we can't always teach in the way we prefer. We have to think about how can we teach in the best way for kids to learn. But sometimes our content area might lend itself to a certain type or a couple of types of teaching. So again, if you're teaching laboratory science, if you're doing laboratories, obviously there's going to be some times where kids are going to be working in small groups and doing experiments. So you have to think about what are all those processes that they need to do in order to be successful with that. One of the areas that we find is really helpful is as you think about this focus of your classroom, we're trying to help students become more independent. So this slide is entitled Major Skill Areas for Independence. So as you're helping the students develop good behavior habits, we're trying to help them focus on how can they learn these habits so that they become less dependent on the teacher. So that's going to be kind of the focus of this area. So there's three larger kind of themes of skills. The first one deals with this idea of focus. So in almost any kind of classroom setting, there needs to be a time when the students stop and maybe listen to directions, or there needs to be a time when they stop and they see a demonstration. So the idea of focus deals with the basics of it's important to have a signal for attention. So as a new teacher, they might teach the students, whenever I say I need your attention, please, I need you to stop, look, and listen. I was working with a new teacher recently, and they were in a community that had a lot of rail service. And in the States, our rail tends to be more freight. We don't have a lot of passenger rail here. But in the community, they had signs at the corners where the trains pass that said, stop, look, and listen. So we worked with the new teacher to come up with, when I say attention, please, you need to stop, look, and listen to me. So basically, we took what the kids had seen on the signs and we integrated it into the classroom. Another area underneath the skills about focus deal with proper voice levels. So if we're going to have kids who are going to work in small groups of 3 or 4, we need to make sure that they are using the appropriate voice level so that we can actually have 3 or 4 groups simultaneously working so that the noise level doesn't get out of control. So underneath the areas of focus, we help new teachers learn 6, 7, 8 different kinds of discrete skills that might be helpful. The second area deals with movement. In probably most classrooms, there is some sort of movement. It could be that students are moving from group to group. It could be that when students come into the classroom, how do they come into the room and find their seat and get their work out without disrupting others? It could be that students need to take care of personal needs, like getting up to sharpen a pencil, or getting up to get materials, or getting up to get a drink of water. So again, that's an area where there's a set of sub-skills that go with this that actually the new teacher can help the students learn how to do. And then the third area, and this, by the way, is the highest level of skill, is maximize learning efforts. So making choices in the classroom. So if the teacher presents, there's 2 different options here, then the student should begin to understand, how do I make the choice? Do I work with my friends, or do I go with another group so that I can actually learn something? Or if the idea is to read something, or the idea is to listen to a tape, again, there's a certain kind of habit that gets formed around this idea of learning how to maximize my learning efforts. And then obviously this quote's really meaningful. Every time I feel like I might be getting frustrated, then I have to think about, what would I want for my own children? And I remember as a brand new teacher, I taught in the intermediate grades, and when parents would come to me at the parent teacher meetings that we had, that we called them conferences, and parents would tell me, I can't get my child to do certain things. I can't get them to go to bed, or I can't get them to clean up at night. And when I didn't have children, I used to think, how can that be? Just just do it. But basically, when you have your own children, it's much different. So keeping that in mind, I think, is really important for new teachers. In the idea of developing the behavior skills, obviously, when we can be proactive and we can help students develop habits, that can be really helpful. But sometimes we have to fall on guidelines and what we call consequences. And consequences are basically things that happen based on if you go outside the rules or the guidelines. So again, with a new teacher, we can't rely on just one area. We have to think about, how do we develop all of these areas? So as you are working, if you're working with new teachers, this might be an area, especially as we're progressing through the school year, that you might need to help them to make adjustments in these rules and some of the things that happen. Or if you're a new teacher, you might need to say, hey, wait a minute, I didn't address everything that I needed to. So obviously, we try to, again, this is one part of a larger classroom management structure. So we try to think about what are some of the guidelines as you develop the expectations in your classroom. Now, a quick aside, this isn't on the slide, but sometimes it can be beneficial for the students to be engaged in the development of the behavior rules or the parameters of the classroom. And in other cases, the teacher might need to have the majority of the rules. And then still in some cases, the teacher might need to lay out the rules. The general rule of thumb on this is, if possible, the more the students can be involved in helping to design the structure of that classroom, the rules, the better it's going to be. Because now they have a stake in it, versus if I just come and say, okay, these are 3 things you can't do here, then that the students don't have that stake. So there are 5 elements here. You've probably had a chance to read these. Obviously, we don't want this to be a list of 17 things. You want to keep the list fairly concise. Obviously, the broader in scope, the better, the wider the net that they cast. So when you talk about show respect to others, that's a pretty wide net. And so that covers a lot of things. Now, you may have to have a conversation about what does that mean. Item number 3, obviously we want to not be what we would call nitpicky, but really kind of focus on what are the major things that we need to have happen. And this is where, if you go back and take a look at what is the preferred teaching methods of the teacher, then you can start thinking about what are the things that we need to address. Item 4, it's much better if the guideline is, or the rule is stated as a what you will do than what you won't do. Many times human behavior dictates when we're told we can't do something, we think, oh, I'm going to do it, and try to, you can't tell me what to do. And then finally, at the end, there should be some type of a general kind of a catch-all that helps with this. And then on the other side of this is what happens if you decide that the student decides that they are not going to follow the guidelines, or what we would call the rule. Those are consequences. And there are 4 things here. It's really important that if there is some type of a consequence administered. Now, by the way, a consequence is a negative aspect that the student can remove by changing. And sometimes we hear about punishment. Punishment is something that maybe cannot be removed. So we try to focus on consequences because you don't necessarily completely destroy the relationship. The first element is they should learn something from it. So if the student's running down the hallway, then having the student go back and show you how they can walk down the hallway, that would be a consequence, but it's a learning component. Now, again, you have to assess, this is the 17th time today I've seen this student running down the hallway. Maybe there's something different that needs to happen, but initially we want to try to learn from it. The second element, what we mean by progressive, is that as things happen outside the boundary, the consequence gets maybe larger, so that we progressively move more toward something that is more harsh. Third element is sometimes we can have very specific things, and then other times we want to be more general. And then finally, typically we build in what's called an escalation clause, which is if the student obviously does something severe or something dangerous to other people, then you don't say, oh, that's the first, that's your first warning, or that's the first, I need you to put that weapon away or whatever. We're going to move to a higher level. I want to briefly talk about difficult behaviors, and that is those things that, these are behaviors that are outside of the boundaries of maybe what the majority of the class might do, and then what would be some strategies for those. So obviously, if you're having either the whole group is having difficulty following a particular guideline, or if you have 1 or 2 students who constantly are talking out or being upset or whatever, obviously we want to figure out what's happening. So sometimes for new teachers, this is hard because they loved their content. They got into teaching because they loved sometimes being learners. And so to be able to step back and say, what could be promoting this disruption, that's really helpful. It might be there's another student in the class that's setting it off. It might be that this student has come from a very traumatic home situation. And so they already come and they're already excited, and any little thing sets them off. It might be a content area. It might be your teaching. So we want to take a look at what could be behind the severe disruption, and then how do we break that particular cycle. What we do with new teachers is we try to help them learn different levels of management. And so sometimes, and again, this is a piece that goes in the toolkit so that as we think about, we're going to try to help the students learn the procedures and learn all of the good learning habits. We're going to have maybe rules and some consequences that provide guidelines. And then these areas are going to be kind of behavior, things that impact behavior that don't call a lot of attention to the behavior. And sometimes when we notice with new teachers that they can get into a fight with a student. So they might say, "Why are you late?" The student says, "None of your business." The teacher said, "Yes, it is my business." The student, they escalate, the behavior, the fighting escalates. So these are ways to intervene, but not escalate. So obviously, what the first thing is, you don't necessarily have to react to everything. And as we work with new teachers, we try to help them to figure out what's really important and what are things that you can kind of overlook. And sometimes when a student may make a noise or drop something or make a inappropriate, minorly inappropriate comment, you might be able just to ignore that and keep teaching. The second one that we use in the United States is something called the look, where the teacher might stop and give the student a look. And again, that might focus it. Stopping or pausing. So if you're teaching and then there's an issue, you might stop for a moment, let things calm back down, and then start again. That kind of goes with what we call freezing a gesture. So if you're at a smart board and you're pointing something out and things start, a disruption happens, you might stop for a moment, look out, let things calm, and then kind of move on. Changing voice speed and volume. This one is somewhat subtle, but highly effective. Sometimes when we get nervous, our voice speed increases, and also the pitch of our voice increases because we're talking more rapidly. That can actually set off students. So this idea that sometimes talking a little bit slower, having a little bit of time between my words or my sentences, letting things soak in, kind of like I'm doing right now, that can really set a different pace in the classroom. Some of you may have had cognitive coaching, and one of the skills in cognitive coaching is what we call pacing and leading. So this idea of changing the voice speed and volume is like the pacing of the emotions of the student. Using the student's name, highly effective. Sometimes we teach new teachers when they have one or two students that need a lot of attention, they may develop what we call a private signal. So the teacher's teaching and maybe the student in the back or the student on the side is getting off track, but they've already met with the student and they've said, "When I notice you're off track, I'm going to touch my nose." And so the teacher, no one else in the room knows the signal, but the teacher makes the nose touch. And then the student knows, "Hey, I need to get myself back on track." Proximity, if we are nearby, it's going to diminish the behavior. When we move away, sometimes the behavior gets accelerated. And then finally, sometimes if you're teaching and you notice a disruption and you just walk over and jot down a note, the students don't know what you're doing, and that can be a way of kind of diminishing the misbehavior. Then level 2 strategies, I won't go into as great a depth on those. These are verbal conversations with students that help to de-escalate the behavior. And then what we're trying to do, obviously, is stay out of power struggles. And I find one of the best skills that we teach new teachers is called temporary suspension of opinion, which is, I don't necessarily have to react. Sometimes I can let something go, kind of like that ignoring piece that we talked about earlier. And then by not reacting, it can really help us not get into that I said, she said, that kind of back and forth arguing. Obviously, another quote, but again, as a new teacher, this is really helpful because it's easy when they get to the disillusionment phase, when they start self-doubting. So obviously they want to be around people who are positive, which again, if you're supporting new teachers, hopefully you are that positive influence in their life. Curriculum management, this is an area that we have some resources for that basically helps you as you think about how do I begin to look at what are the essential learnings, how do I take a look at those essential learnings and then assess them, how do I what we call scaffold the learning so that students can learn easier pieces or maybe some of the components and then put it all together for the larger piece. As I mentioned earlier, the curriculum management is not only a key to teaching and learning, but it's also a key to classroom management. And then assessment, and what we try to provide are some fairly straightforward to implement, but very powerful learning strategies, such as you've probably heard of the exit card. When at the end of a lesson, you might give the students a card and it might say, answer these 2 questions. Then the students spend the last 5-6 minutes of class answering. And then when the period ends, when they go to another class, they have to actually show you the exit card. And then you can assess, did they learn or did they not learn? That's really helpful to find out, do I need to reteach something the next day? I think in one of the resources we actually have, or in the book, I know we have a reproducible little card that has things that they can circle like yes, no, and they can hold them up. So again, those are good ways of doing what we call formative or informal kinds of assessment to give you an idea of kind of where people are at. The last section of the book really kind of deals with this whole idea of student engagement, which, as you know, is a really big focus right now. And we're trying to help teachers to move away from them providing all of the information and the students just sitting. So this idea of how do we engage students in the classroom is really, really helpful. And there's just a variety of things, you know, there's technology tools that are useful, but also some old-fashioned things. This is actually a picture of me. I was in China a couple of years ago, and we were working with at a what they call a normal university there that was preparing teachers, and we were trying to help them brainstorm ideas for how do you develop higher level thinking. In China, they are really good at copying. They're really good at duplication, but they're not really good at thinking originally. So I broke the students into small groups, and then we went around to each of the groups and we looked at the brainstormed ideas. So Justin, that's the end of the webinar, and I'm going to turn it back to you.
Great, thank you for that, John. Really appreciate it. So we're just going to move into some questions now. So if you would like to type your questions into the chat dialog box, and I'll voice them through to John for him to answer to. Okay, so there appears to be no questions coming through, which is okay. That's not a problem at all. If you do think of some questions later on, please feel free to email me. I will bring up my email address in just a minute. Just wanted to highlight some upcoming professional learning events. John and Sheila Eller, you will actually see them at our upcoming International Summit on PLC at Work in Melbourne on the 29th and 30th of August. Early bird rate is still available for that at the moment. And just some other cognitive coaching foundation training seminars to be held in Melbourne and also on the Sunshine Coast. And we've got our big Thinking Learning Conference in Melbourne also. And once again, there are my details there. The recording of the webinar will be issued out within the next 5 business days. So you will have the chance to share this with your team also. And there's my email address there if you do think of any questions or if you need any further support from us here at Hawker Brownlow or John Eller. So thank you once again, John, for your time, and thank you to all the participants on the webinar too. We really appreciate the time you've taken out of your school to join this webinar. We do have another webinar coming up on the 10th of May at 9 a.m. Melbourne time, which is developing the care factor in your school with John and Sheila Eller. So thank you once again, everyone, and we hope you have a great day.